Hello again, students. By now, we have studied all about cells and how the macromolecules and organelles they are made of help them to carry out the functions of life. In this new section, we will continue to look at how cells work. We will be focusing on the very important question of how cells acquire the molecules they need if they are surrounded by a barrier, the cell membrane, like the one you see here. So if we're surrounded by a cell membrane, how do things get in and out of the cell? By the time we are done this section, I will want you to be able to do the following. 1, I want you to be able to describe how cell membranes are selectively permeable. 2, you should be able to explain how the two broad categories of molecule transport, which are passive and active transport, are different from each other. And finally, I'd like for you to be able to identify the circumstances for which the processes of diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, active transport, and endo and exocytosis would be used to move molecules in living cells. Okay, so why are we going to take the time to study all these different types of molecule transport? The reason is because the types of molecules that are allowed to travel into and out of your cells will determine how well the cells can function, which in turn, of course, affects how well the whole organism functions. Let's begin our study of molecule transport by considering a metaphor. I want you to picture in your head your own home. In our homes, how do we make sure that we can let some things in or out, while at the same time preventing other unwanted things from coming in or out? I hope you are picturing things such as walls or doors, which can keep strangers out of our personal living spaces and give us some control over who comes in and out. I also hope that some of you came up with the idea of screens or fences, which can prevent the entrance of such things like bugs and pests, or, of course, block the exit of our pets and small children from the spaces where they're supposed to be contained. Now, let's consider the items listed above. I want you to notice that some of these examples can be considered permeable, and that some are not. Recall from our lab this morning that permeable means that other things can pass through it. Can you determine which of these are permeable? If you said screens and fences, you are correct. While a wall or a closed door can prevent most objects or substances from passing through, things like screens and fences may let some things in. Of course, we know that what can get through a screen or fence depends on size. For example, fresh air or dust or microscopic organisms may pass through a screen or fence, but things like moths or mosquitoes or leaves will not because they're too large. Therefore, we could call screens or fences by the special term selectively permeable because they allow some things to pass through, but not everything. In other words, they are picky or selective about what they let through. So, all this talk about barriers around our home has a point. In the same way that your homes are protected by various barriers, each one of your cells is also surrounded by a barrier called the cell membrane. Your cell membranes, in reality, are more like screens or fences than they are like walls or doors. And the reason is because your cell membranes are selectively permeable. We need to be able to get some things into our cells, like nutrients, oxygen, as well as get other things out, like waste products, while at the same time preventing some things from moving through altogether. So in this way, just like a screen or a fence, our cell membranes are selectively permeable. There are three main ways that molecules can move through the cell membrane that I will be talking to you about in this section. The first is called passive transport. And passive transport is a category which includes three different processes. They're listed here: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. The second is called active transport. And the final way is endocytosis and exocytosis. I will explain the types of passive transport in the next lecture, and then move on to active transport and endo and exocytosis in lecture 3. So, before we close our discussion tonight, the last thing I want to do is point out some detail on the picture at the bottom of this slide. This is a simplistic diagram of what the cell membrane looks like close up. As you learned in chapter 2.1, the cell membrane is formed of many lipid molecules. I'm going to color them in. These things that look like little people, maybe stick figures with 2 legs. These are all lipid molecules. They happen to be lined up next to each other, as you can see, in 2 oppositely facing rows. So over here we can see we've got one row of lipids and then the opposite row of lipids, and they're facing each other. These 2 opposing layers are called the lipid bilayer. Now, within the lipid bilayer, which is the cell membrane, there are also many large proteins. These are called transport proteins. They kind of look like potatoes. I'll color them in here pink. These are transport proteins. Okay. These transport proteins can be found studded throughout the lipid bilayer, and we will learn that they are there because they act like tunnels or doors for transporting some kinds of special molecules across the membrane. We will learn more about how they work in the upcoming lectures. Okay, that's it for tonight. Don't forget to do the Quizmodo, and I'll see you tomorrow.